Okay, so thank you very much, all of you, for joining this other international seminar of GERPISA. I don't know how many of you are still already familiar with the GERPISA network, how many of you are already members of the network or just joined this session because you have seen it advertised on our pages. If you're not familiar with the network, we invite you to have a look at our website where we publish like publications on the automobile industry, all events. We have social media channels that we will share afterwards. I don't know if you are tweeting, but we are on Twitter. We are on Facebook, we are on LinkedIn, and we try to share the same information on all channels. This is one appointment within the series of monthly seminars. We have international seminars in English language, others in French language. For those of you who are willing to join both, they're all open. We always publish the link on our website, so please always have a look if you are interested. Today we have two speakers on this topic that we thought was a hot topic for those in the network, because as Anna and Jamie will see, we have a variety of participants in this network that are broadly interested in the automobile industry, but are also interested more specifically on the platform services, on in mobility services, urban transport issues, and so on and so forth. So you will see that there will be different angles, and not last, in employment and work-related issues. So this is a very interdisciplinary network with a focus on the automobile industry. And this will, I'm sure, will reflect also in the questions that will be raised at the end of the talk. Before introducing the two speakers, you can all imagine that talking about Uber is a very wide topic. So we won't cover everything about the Uber as a phenomenon, but we have decided to try and focus the discussion on three main issues. There are, on one side, through the work that Anna and Jamie have done extensively on organizing experiences and state responses to workers organizing in the sector. Through these experiences and the fieldwork that they've both conducted, we have decided to try and reflect on three main points. One is whether Uber as a business model is sustainable. So this is an open question, also seen through the lenses of the COVID crisis. The second issue is the attempt, whether there's been attempts, often in response to labor organizing, to regulate the sector and how states have attempted to do so. The third issue is looking at the actual social impact that the Uber crisis, the COVID crisis is having through the Uber case. So this is the framework. We have two speakers. We have Anna Johnston. Please welcome both of them. Anna Johnston, who's currently a postdoctoral fellow at the Northeastern University in Boston, in Massachusetts. She has a past of both researcher and organizing in the platform sector, but also as an academic in the agricultural field and gaming sector. She has had different focuses in her research and her organizing experiences. She has previously worked for the International Labour Organization and for the ETUI, the European Trade Union Institute. And here she will extract some work that she started through, Anna, you will correct me if I'm wrong, but she will extract some work that she started for her doctorate, for her PhD, that focused on the experience of the New York Taxi Workers Alliance in the US, and the positive experience in terms of organizing, but also this specific case in terms of attempt to regulate the sector. Jamie Woodcock is currently a senior lecturer at the Open University and also an independent researcher based in London. He has extensive research experience on different sectors as well, but in particular on the platform economy that today we'll tackle through different fieldwork experiences. He is author of already 3 finished books, but as we heard at the beginning, there are several others in the pipeline. The Gig Economy, Marks at the Arcade and Working the Phones. I think, Jamie, if participants here are interested in your work, I think you share everything on your website, right? So maybe you can also provide the link. Jamie is also on the editorial board of Notes from Below and Historical Materialism. And here we'll start his talk providing a broader overview of what transport platform work is through different cases, including the UK, Europe, India, South Africa, and the US. And we'll try to reflect on organizing experiences, looking at 3 main issues. One, the attempts of workers that started from being isolated to connect. Another issue is the communication with the platform. The third issue that it will cover is the internationalization of platforms. We will see all this in more detail. As usual, we will have 2 presentations. Then we will have a short break for people to steam off and have a tea or a coffee. And then we will have a discussion. All of you are you are invited to intervene either by raising your hand or writing your questions in the chat. We will read them afterwards. Thank you very much. I leave it to you. I don't know who starts first. You decide. Thank you very much.
I'm happy either way, Hannah, if you would like to go first, or I'm happy to go.
Maybe you should go, sort of broader overview to start. How's that?
Yeah, that sounds good to me. Okay, so I want to start by giving a little bit of context to where this project came from. I mean, Lorenzo, of course, gave an incredibly kind introduction both to Hannah and myself. But I want to start, and I'm going to slightly stretch the Uber category, but I have a reason for doing so, which is that I'm going to talk about Uber in terms of transportation, but also food delivery in terms of Uber Eats, and also Deliveroo, because it is analogous to Uber Eats, at least in the UK and most of Europe. So it's a slight broadening out from Uber as car transportation specifically, but I think there are a number of reasons why we should do this. The first reason is because this was my entry into doing research in platform work. And I want to talk a bit about the first experience I had with platform workers. And I'm going to use a series of, let's call them ethnographic examples to try and illustrate what I think are some of the key dynamics for workers in the gig economy, and some of the things that we can say about what has happened over the last 5 years. So when I first started to do research with platform workers, I had not heard of Deliveroo before. This was in early 2016. And I always think this is an important thing for academics to remember, that when we're teaching our students, many of our students are out in the world working, and have experiences of work that perhaps we might not have had or don't have access to. So one of my students told me that he was working for Deliveroo. We later went on to write some things about Deliveroo together. But as is often the case with these things, once the student had told me about Deliveroo, I began to start seeing Deliveroo drivers all across London, gathering outside restaurants and so on. And my interest in Deliveroo and also my interest in Uber is because at the time, many commentators were beginning to say that these were unorganizable workers, that they wouldn't be able to collectively organize over their conditions. And I want to talk about a couple of examples of these because I think that argument has become less common today, certainly not disappeared, but I think empirical evidence is beginning to show that these arguments had some problems with them. So in the UK, a Labour MP, Siobhan McDonough, argued that they can't organise because they don't have a workplace. They just won't find the same unity of cause, that there's always somebody who will do this work if you don't want to, so it's impossible for you to organise. Similarly, an academic in the UK, Alex Wood, argued that there's such a high turnover of people, and after all, they have low market bargaining power, that if they go on strike, they're not going to bring the economy to a halt. They're not like coal miners or rail workers. Some commentators blamed precariousness, that these were just precarious workers who couldn't organize. Some blamed them as being young workers and that somehow young workers wouldn't want to organize. Some talked about the nature of work fundamentally different, that technology had undermined the ability for these workers to organize, or a combination of these things, that they were migrant workers, precarious workers using technology, and so therefore they wouldn't be able to organize. And I'd come across a lot of these arguments in a project with call center workers in London, that they wouldn't be able to organize. And so I was interested in it, and this is something that influences a lot of my research, to think of groups of workers that other people say are unorganizable, and to spend time with them understanding how they actually do resist and do organize in various ways. And this argument, as I say, hasn't disappeared. You know, it continues with many of these groups of workers. But of course, what I found is the moment I went with this student to meet Deliveroo riders, that they were already beginning to organize in 2016. So this is 5 years ago now. When we went to restaurants and we spoke to riders, similarly as when we went to the airport and spoke to Uber drivers or other places that people gather, that while these workers may not have a workplace in a traditional sense, they had places that they met collectively. And in a sense, these became like the water cooler in an office. So the archways near a restaurant that you could shelter from the rain, or the places that made sense to wait to pick up work. And of course, many of these workers connected with each other on WhatsApp. So I remember the first meeting we had, a driver invited me into a WhatsApp group of a couple of hundred drivers who were already discussing challenges with pay, how they could get a pay rise from Deliveroo. So this group of workers that many people had argued was isolated, atomized, you know, unable to form a collective, you know, sense of what they wanted from work, in reality were beginning the building blocks of organization, the forming of networks and so on. And these WhatsApp networks played a key role in what was arguably the first strike of platform workers, at least in the UK, in the summer of 2016. And if people are interested, and I'm not going to talk too much more about Deliveroo, because as I promised, this will be more about Uber, but Callum Cant has written a fantastic book called Riding for Deliveroo, which I would really recommend, which covers these dynamics of organizing in this work, but also looks at how the strikes in the UK triggered a wave of strikes across Europe, with these workers keeping in touch with each other through social media and sharing techniques and tactics. And I think this experience is one that has repeated not only in London, but in other countries, of workers coming together to find ways to share the experience of this work, whether as Uber drivers or Bolt drivers or Deliveroo couriers. And I think the meeting points and the use of WhatsApp are a really important reminder that workers are not passive actors in work, regardless of whether it's platform work or otherwise. Workers engage with and respond to the contradictions of work, find ways to make sense of it, find ways to engage in it that might benefit them more. And so I want to paraphrase E.P. Thompson here to say that platform workers were present at their own making. They had a history before they signed up to work for platforms, and they bring this with them to the work. The experience of working elsewhere, how they might have resisted or organized in other forms of work, their existing social networks, the politics they've been involved in, and their own desires and wants from the work. They don't arrive as individuals new to working on platforms and have to start from scratch. And so in this talk, what I want to draw attention to are these, what I call, I guess, 3 moments of solidarity, which I talk about in much more detail, to have a shameless self-plug, in a forthcoming book called The Fight Against Platform Work, which, as Lorenzo said, will be available for free on my website to read, because I think everybody should have access to read such things. But the 3 moments that I talk about that I want to introduce in this talk, the first is these increasing connections between platform workers. That the empirical evidence now shows that these workers are not isolated, that they find ways to build networks, to create communities, to share the experience of work. The second is around a lack of communication and specifically negotiation with platforms. That many of these workers find it difficult to enter into communication with the platform in any meaningful sense, and that platforms are unwilling to negotiate around terms and conditions, which has 2, I think, important factors that flow from it. The first is that workers find each other to communicate with, to solve problems about the work or so on. And the other is that it leads to escalating worker action around shared issues. That unlike many forms of traditional work, where a supervisor might mediate a concern or a grievance that workers have, find some way to deflect anger that people have at work, the lack of communication means that many of these issues build and build until workers take action. And particularly in the UK, we've seen this action take the form of wildcat strike action. So people withdrawing their labour, not going through legalised balloting routes and so on to raise their grievances. The third issue is around the internationalization of platforms, which I want to make an argument that this has changed some of the dynamics around how we can understand transport work vis-a-vis how it might have been organized previously. And I think that each of these factors stems not accidentally from this work, but from how this work is technically arranged. So how this work is being arranged by platforms results in some of these factors emerging. The first example, with the increased connectivity between workers, can clearly be seen, yourself, if you go and talk to these workers or you examine some of the factors that have come out of these strikes. But platform workers are increasingly connected to each other. The second dynamic, involving the lack of communication from platforms, I've first noticed this in a kind of interesting way. So as Lorenzo said, I've done some chunks of field work in the UK, but also in South India, in South Africa, in the US and elsewhere. And I want to tell a short ethnographic story about a meeting with delivery drivers in Bangalore. Anybody who knows much about Bangalore knows it's a city of terrible traffic. You can really only plan to do one thing a day because the traffic can be so dense. It's also a city with fantastic food and quite wide-ranging food delivery networks. So food delivery is very, very popular in Bangalore. And although they don't have Uber Eats and Deliveroo, they have a very analogous set of platforms in Swiggy and Zomato. And during the time I was doing research there, I spent time wandering around Bangalore, talking to delivery drivers. And in a large city like that, it can be quite hard as somebody who who didn't grow up in Bangalore to know where the meeting points might be. And I remember one day, particularly hot day, of really struggling to find any drivers to talk to. And so to come up with a solution to this, we decided to get into the back of an Uber and ask an Uber driver where we could find delivery riders. Now, of course, the Uber drivers know very well where these meeting points are because they spend their time driving around the city, seeing where other workers are, sharing meeting points and so on. It created a bit of a problem because how do you put into the Uber app, we would like to go to a place where we can find collective groups of workers and talk to them about organizing and resisting. Uber doesn't quite have that function for drivers on the app at present, surprisingly. So instead we paid the driver with cash and didn't use the Uber app for that trip. And he immediately took us to a kind of hidden side road with 30 or so delivery drivers sat on steps drinking coffee and talking to each other. And at this point, we had not heard of there being any strikes of food delivery workers in Bangalore. So nothing had been reported in the press. You couldn't kind of find any evidence at this time that organizing was happening. And with a very excellent master's student called Pradyumna, who we were working with in Bangalore, we had some kind of semi-translated conversations with workers. There are kind of 4 main languages in Bangalore. So we're kind of switching in and out of English and Kannada and other languages. And we got speaking to people. And what was remarkable about this was how similar the conversations were to London. Is riders would say that their main grievances were pay, and pay. That once they signed up, they saw their pay beginning to decline. And they were talking about a fall of 60 rupees for a delivery just down to 30 rupees. And I asked one of them, what have you done about this? Have you thought about collective organizing or anything like this? And they said, yeah, of course we have. We had a strike last week of 300-400 workers. We managed to gain a concession from the platform. So the strike lasted a very short period of time. And kind of surprised, he said, well, how often have things like this happened? I said, quite often we've been taking strikes. We've been organizing for a while. But of course, because they'd been successful, and the strikes had ended quite quickly, they hadn't been reported anywhere. There kind of wasn't enough time for other people to find out about these strikes. And when I returned to London, I remember having a discussion in a very similar way with drivers, of talking about the falling rates of pay for deliveries, and particularly the risks of transportation work. And what I think is interesting about this is that the behavior of platforms, whether Uber in India or Uber in the UK, is remarkably similar. There's lack of communication around changes to working conditions, changes to payment plans, that then result in quite similar forms of action from workers in response. If a platform notifies you that your pay has changed, you're not left with much other option than to take strike action if you want to oppose it. This has kind of meant that whether in London or Bangalore, we can see wildcat strikes as being a kind of emergent and dominant form, perhaps. But the other dynamic that I want to talk about is around the internationalization of platforms and the experience of work. And if you'll indulge me, I have another ethnographic story to tell to illustrate what I mean about this. So the first time that I went to South Africa to interview Uber drivers, I got an Uber from the airport in Cape Town. The flight is quite long from London to Cape Town. So in my kind of jet lag state, I thought this is the first kind of initial interview I can do. I can have a bit of a discussion with this driver about what it's like to be an Uber driver in Cape Town. Uber drivers in Cape Town are often very chatty. We spoke in the back of the cab about, the issues they'd had, the issues with pay, problems of access to vehicles, the role of migration for many of these riders. And it was a kind of usual conversation. It's one I've had in many other places. I kind of didn't think it was, particularly different. until the driver asked me a question. And he said, oh, what's the latest with the protests of Uber drivers in London? And so we spoke about the protests that had happened the previous week in London. We were kind of talking away about this, and he was saying, oh yeah, you know, we follow this, we've been kind of interested. He wanted to know more about the kind of vehicles that drivers in London have, you know, comparing what would be common, talking about what the different rates were and so on. And I thought, you know, this is a great conversation. I got out of the cab, and then I thought to myself, if I had traveled to Cape Town 5 or 10 years previously, what would the chances have been that a, you know, driver in Cape Town would be interested in mini cab drivers in East London, would know much about the conditions of mini cab drivers, would go on social media to find out about whether they'd had protests, would be at all interested in building connections with a cab driver in another country. And I think what's interesting about this is that Uber as a platform, and I think this is where I will try and pull the talk back a bit more specifically to talk about Uber, creates a number of interesting dynamics. Is Uber as an international platform has put a huge amount of effort with drivers into creating an image of an Uber driver. Now, of course, much of this image of the Uber driver has been about insisting on the image of a self-employed driver, someone who is not an employee in a traditional sense, but is, you know, using Uber because they're, you know, whatever the current way that Uber spins the bogus self-employment that they use to engage drivers. But there's a lot of emphasis on building a collective image of an Uber driver. And I think in an unforeseen way, this means that we get a shared experience of what it's like to drive for Uber, whether you're in Cape Town or London or Bangalore or San Francisco. And so it creates the potential for people to engage in transnational conversations about the nature of driving for Uber. And I want to tell a couple of examples about how I think this has been a useful thing for thinking about organizing. So one of the projects that I was involved in last year was bringing together Uber drivers from different countries for a conference to talk about organizing as Uber drivers. And of course, there are issues around language. There are issues around the specific differences with regulation in some countries compared to other countries. The UK, people might know or might not know, has an intermediate employment status, for example. We don't just have employee status and self-employed, we have an intermediate worker status. Some countries have two. You know, in some places, the state is much more muscular with regulation. In some countries, Uber drivers have to have a license from the state to drive. In other countries, they don't. So there are regional differences, of course. And I think in some ways, this is a kind of important thing to remember with platforms, that there is, of course, the image of the Uber driver, but how Uber operates in different regions can be quite different as they try to find a way to integrate themselves into the existing national frameworks, you know, relationships with other kinds of transportation, with the law, with regulation, and so on. But despite that, some of the conversations that these drivers were able to have were fascinating conversations. You know, conversations about coordinating action on similar days, of sharing what had worked in one place or another. And I think we saw an example of what this could look like in the run-up to Uber's initial public offering, the Uber's IPO, where drivers in different countries coordinated to either take strikes or to have public protests on the same day, to kind of reimagine what a kind of more genuine labor internationalism or transnational solidarity could look like. There's very often these moments of transnational coordination are coordinated through union affiliations and then come down from that. Whereas this came from drivers finding each other on WhatsApp, on Twitter, on Facebook, and coordinating on a kind of driver to driver level rather than a union to union level. I think there are some observations we can make about this for organizing. You in terms of how this could help to generalize the best experiences of organizing from one place to another. But I also think there are some useful comparisons we can make, and I think this is why Hannah's contribution is so interesting, to think about the different models of organizing that are beginning to emerge. Is we have examples of existing trade unions that are organizing with these workers. We have examples of new trade unions that are emerging and beginning to organize with these workers. And we have examples of worker networks that are not part of unions. And I think it's quite an exciting moment to think about trade unionism, of how it is adapting or being adapted in the current context. Because in many cases, the widespread growth of platform work has shown up some of the weaknesses of the existing trade union movement. In the UK, for example, many mainstream trade unions are unwilling or unprepared to engage with organizing platform workers. In other cases, unions are being pulled into this, and I think are learning something about how work has changed and how organizing needs to be adapted. The union that I do research with in the UK, the Independent Workers Union of Great Britain, is a kind of new alternative union that has been organizing with Uber drivers as well as migrant workers and others, which is, I think, a kind of interesting experiment in contemporary trade unionism. But then we also have worker networks in many countries that aren't seeking to become unions, that are seeking to connect people and experiment in different ways. And so I think we can look at Uber as a kind of case study, both of contemporary platform business models, but also as a testing ground for how workers respond to and try to reshape these companies. And see that for now, those early arguments about whether these workers can organize or not, whether these workers are unorganizable, has clearly been shown to not be an accurate assessment, but that we don't have a clear picture of what sustainable or longer term organizing that can win from these platforms look like. Is that in many cases, the kind of action that's happened has been performative around the IPO, which no doubt had an impact on Uber's share price, but wasn't a collective negotiation over new terms and conditions. But that the answer of what organizing looks like in this field, I think in many cases is still a very open question. And I think is one that a dialogue, not only with researchers that are looking at platform work, but with organizers in other fields, with people who have an academic interest in the automobile industry, like this seminar, of bringing together those different perspectives to try and make sense of exactly what is happening here. But I guess what I want to conclude on really is to say that, in a sense, we shouldn't be surprised that these dynamics have emerged. I think one of the major weaknesses of looking at Uber, whether it's the taxi transportation or food delivery, is that there has perhaps been too much emphasis on the role of technology and the platform nature of these companies. I think instead what we really need to focus on is how does this technology get used within the labor process? So how is the technology actually used when directing people to pick up passengers or to deliver food? I also think that it's very important that we draw attention to the social dimensions of this work. So how workers themselves are constituted as Uber drivers. And I think here particularly important is looking at the role of migration. In the UK at least, many of these workers are already in contact with each other because they come from shared routes of migration. Whether the Brazilian migrants that deliver food, who make up a substantial portion of food delivery workers in London, who have very dense migrant networks, often already related to organizing in one way or another, or Bengali drivers in East London who tend to have existing networks that brought them onto Uber and that they maintain as drivers. But we have to see how these things fill in a bigger part of the picture of how Uber works, and not buy into the argument that Uber is just a technology company. I also think that we have to see that this is underpinned by two key features of platform work. The first is that platform work is indeed work. It's not some kind of flexible self-employment. It is an employment relationship of some kind. That platforms exert managerial control over workers, that they profit by exploiting surplus value generated during the labor process of these riders, or at least that's what they're aiming to do. And that while platforms may pretend not to be employers, the way that they control and surveil the labor process doesn't represent some kind of break from the employment relationship. In fact, the actions taken by platforms to limit their appearance as employers, not communicating with workers, refusing to negotiate with them, in fact, sharpen the contradictions of this as an employment process. They lead to new forms of resistance. Platforms deliberately minimize their training, reduce their support, refuse to provide equipment, deactivate workers without appeal, refuse to negotiate, all as part of this ruse of bogus self-employment. And indeed, that's why many workers increasingly turn to wildcat strike action as one of the few ways available to them organizationally to raise their grievances. And so platforms' desire to appear not as an employer turns them instead into an even more hostile employer, one that we could think of even more as representing themselves as employers. And the second feature is connected to this, that platform workers are indeed workers, that they're not disconnected small businesses plying their trade across a range of business opportunities. And I want to draw attention to the fact that in the UK, deliverers are in court once again over employment status to determine whether or not they're an employer. And we also have the Uber case in court again in the UK to decide on employment status. So even these things are still, in the UK context, legally contested. But I do think it's worth saying that whilst these are obviously not independent businesses that are plying their trade, across many platforms, flexibility is something that workers do talk about as a key reason that they sign up. And so I think there's a pressing need for us to push back against the conception of flexibility that comes from platforms. Many workers join these platforms because of the problems with existing work and the desire for flexibility. The result, of course, is not a flexible work that they receive, but one that has its terms and conditions increasingly driven down, to use a Uber-related pun. And I guess what I want to finish on here is to come back to the E.P. Thompson quote that I started with, that platform workers were present at their own making, but people who began working as platform workers bring with them a history, traditions, organizing communities, and so on. That I think they're increasingly now present in the ways that they fight to contest and resist this platform work. But that what we don't know is where those struggles will lead, what that will mean for Uber as a platform, what that will mean in different countries. But I think what we can be certain is to say that their struggles will be what shapes the future of platforms. And so we should keep our analytical eye and our conversations with workers in that field if we really want to understand it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Please, no, I see, can you hear me? Yeah, so I see some raised hands. Please, what we will do, we will still have Anna's presentation now, and we will have the full debate after a short break afterwards. So please don't leave, keep your questions for later, okay? Thank you very much. You can also, if you want, you can start writing them down in the chat if you prefer. Otherwise, please raise your hand as soon as we start the Q&A session after the break. Thank you, Anna, please.
Okay, thanks for having me. I do have some slides. I help keep myself on task here. So I'm going to do a screen share. Is that, can you see that? Yes, okay, great. Thank you again for the invitation. thank you, Jamie, for your presentation. I think that provides a really great sort of context and kind of big picture view. I'm going to delve into sort of a particular case study of how some of these trends that Jamie has mentioned, both around organizing, but also some of the features of work, how technology has impacted the labor process have played out in New York City. So as Lorenza mentioned, you know, I've been engaged in platform work research in a number of different organizations and fora. Right now I'm at Northeastern University. Much of the research that was done for what I will present today was done as through my dissertation work, but I continue to be a strong ally of the New York Taxi Workers Alliance and supporter of them as I am able. So I just want to start sort of with a kind of a flash at the present moment. And I think sort of explaining where we are today in the context of COVID and of some of the struggles that are happening in New York City, we really need to sort of do a bit of a historical dive as well to really sort of unearth how we got to where we are right now. So in last September, I opened the New York Times. I'm a regular reader of the New York Times, check at least the front page every day. And when I opened the front page of the New York Times, I saw all of these intimately familiar faces, you know, people who I know by first name, standing in the middle of the Brooklyn Bridge, surrounded by their vehicles, and New York Taxi Workers Alliance banners and signs that say things like, "We served and believed, New York City and banks lied and deceived," and other signs that said things like, "Let us live." And this was very much in line with some sort of findings that I had through the course of my research and sort of allied work I'd done with the New York Taxi Workers Alliance that was not COVID specific, but had been unfolding really since sort of 2011, 2012, when Uber first entered the New York City taxi market. So taxis in New York City sort of have these iconic yellow cabs. They are part of a broader for-hire vehicle infrastructure. So these are vehicles that are hired by individuals for trips, kind of personal transit. New York City is the largest taxi cab industry in the United States. And it is really in a lot of ways can be described as a private industry that's offering a public service. So it's highly regulated, traditional yellow cab industry, highly regulated. We'll get into sort of more of that a little bit later, but the sort of costs and expenses and things like this are really underwritten by those who have a financial stake in the industry. And in fact, New York City taxi cabs collect for every single ride sort of a 50-cent charge that goes to fund things like public transportation in the city. So in fact, it's a subsidizing, has a subsidizing role for public transit more broadly in the city. But to Jamie's point about sort of organizing and workers being unorganizable, one of the things about being a provider of public services is that taxi workers in New York, like transport workers in a lot of places, they have sort of unique points of leverage in how they express their sort of collective grievances. And so here, to be on the Brooklyn Bridge, you can imagine how in a city like New York, which has sort of also another place where it's notorious for their traffic and things like this, how even, you know, traffic that moves at 30 kilometers an hour, 15 miles an hour or so, could draw to a halt very quickly. And how drivers would be able to use sort of their sort of role bottleneck to really put bottlenecks in things. And much in the same way that other scholars who study things like the auto industry have talked about, just-in-time production systems, and how if you sort of put a wrench in one system of a production system, it can draw everything to a halt. And so that's really often how drivers in New York have expressed their collective grievances and these wildcat strikes, very similarly to sort of draw things to a halt. So I have sort of two questions that I want to address here today. One is on this sort of question of digital labor platforms more generally. So the taxi industry has been particularly affected by this. And I want to answer the question of why there's been such a transformation, I guess, of the taxi industry specifically. And the second question is related to some regulation that was introduced in 2018 or so, that introduced a vehicle cap for New York City's for the number of drivers, of Uber drivers, Lyft drivers, other app-based drivers, and also proposed and subsequently implemented a citywide fare for the industry. And just in the context of the US, while New York City has a much higher unionization rate than other places and some other sort of pro-worker legislation, we're not talking about Sweden here. It's really different expectations when it comes to pro-worker regulation. So how does something like that happen in New York City? And to answer these questions, the first question I'm going to answer really through providing some historical context on neoliberal reforms and how that's really impacted the taxi market specifically, and how that sort of paved the way in many ways for firms like Uber to really disrupt things in the way that they have. And the second question around sort of regulation and how that came to happen, I'm going to use a framework that was developed in the 70s by Hirschman, this idea of exit, voice, loyalty, and neglect. So how do workers, it's sometimes being used, relative to consumers and other things like this, how do people express their dissatisfaction with something? In this case, it's how do workers express their dissatisfaction with something like working conditions or wages? And this particular framework initially presented sort of two options. You can either vote with your feet and leave, right? You can find a different job. You can, quit your job and go work elsewhere. Or you can use your voice to try to change policies and practices where you are currently employed. Later, sort of these ideas of loyalty, are the propensity for someone to maybe tend towards one of those two options was sort of added to this framework. And then neglect, which I think is really crucial when thinking about precarious workers who may have sort of limited labor market opportunities elsewhere. So that's sort of, hunker down, bear it, even if it's not great working conditions. Under those circumstances, it's often will lead to sort of further erosion of sort of any standards that are in place. And so my particular research, I was really focused on the New York City Taxi Workers Alliance. And my interest in this organization particularly comes from sort of my own history of working with labor unions and trade unions, at this intersection of sort of collective organizing and non-standard work, and specifically among workers who could not join labor unions, who were legally exempt from joining labor unions in the United States. So previously I had worked in the agricultural sector in the United States. Excuse me, I'm sorry, I have a little bit of a cold. In the United States, agricultural workers are exempt from joining unions. The history of that has to do with sort of very racist policies in the context of Jim Crow South during the time that labor legislation was introduced, and a carve out of entire workforces that were comprised of racialized groups. So those were, exceptions were made for groups like farm workers, for domestic workers. And then exceptions were also made for self-employed workers. And the reasons for that were quite different, that why would you need to join a union if you were self-employed and dictating the terms and conditions of your own work, right? And then that came to also sort of play into antitrust sort of rules and regulations, that if you have a bunch of employers who come together and try to do something like set wages or fix prices, that's seen as interfering with commerce. So having worked in agriculture, I decided, that I was ready to be in sort of an urban environment and things like this. And so I was in New York City, was in touch with the New York Taxi Workers Alliance. And again, this is sort of I think the first time I met them was, over a decade ago now, pre-Uber, right? My questions were really motivated by it had nothing to do with Uber. It had nothing to do with apps. And I was focused on sort of worker perspectives and experiences and really understanding this toolbox of strategies that workers develop absent sort of formal collective bargaining or legally recognized unionization. And I should say that the New York Taxi Workers Alliance have a really sort of class-based analysis and call themselves a union. And so I will refer to them as a union, but they do not engage in collective bargaining for these legal reasons. So into that comes this sort of technological transformation. Uber arrives on the scene and things start to change really, really quickly. So just a couple of other notes about the New York Taxi Workers Alliance specifically. It is a really sort of dynamic group of self-employed workers. They were the first AFL-CIO affiliate, which is the sort of union aggregate in the United States. Really very diverse group. So it came out of the Organizing Committee Against Anti-Asian Violence. This is a highly immigrant workforce, many of whom are South Asian, but also sort of large contingents from Latin America, the Dominican Republic specifically, West Africa, really, really very, very diverse. And the organization has really sort of leaned into the strength that can come out of sort of diversity and broad-based organizing. So I did a lot of archival research, participant observation, was involved in a survey that the Taxi Workers Alliance conducted, and then also a lot of interviews, and I'm happy to sort of chat more about methods specifically. But I want to sort of move on to this kind of first question that I posed. So why have these apps impacted the taxi industry specifically so drastically? In the United States, I'm speaking to you today from Canada. The story has been very similar here throughout Europe, but and the situation there's some interesting parallels, I think, between sort of developing countries and, again, features of non-standard work and for hire industries sort of historically being sort of unregulated or underregulated, and how that might lead to companies like Uber being able to move in like fairly easily. In the context of the taxi industry in New York, for many, many, many decades, taxi drivers were considered employees. There were various trade union campaigns with various levels of success that, again, went on for sort of decades. Importantly, I'll mention sort of one thing about sort of early industry regulation, and then I'm going to sort of skip ahead to the 1970s. But in 1937, this was a time, again, of sort of great economic downturn and turmoil, that the taxi industry historically has been a place that has received workers during times of high levels of unemployment. And in 1937, economic downturn, the taxi market was absolutely flooded, and drivers could no longer make a living wage. And these were people that were moving from industries like construction in the city. The city got together and they said, okay, this is really an untenable situation. What we need to do is implement a medallion system or a permit system for people to be able to drive in the city. And so they did that. They froze the number of medallions that were on the street. And what ended up happening is people sort of began to fall out of the industry, and they did not replace them. And eventually they sort of created policies so that they could do sort of private transfer of medallions and buy and sell them, so that they could stabilize the number. And that number was stabilized around 13,587, I think is the number. Or at least it was when I was sort of delving through these historical records. So, so that was really for this sort of iconic yellow cab industry. And over time, that came to be associated with particular privileges. So street hail rights, the right to pick up someone in the street just by sort of raising your arm. Only yellow cabs had the right to stop for those workers. And that's important because there were always sort of other types of for-hire vehicles, right? There were always limousines that were active, sort of black cars that served, higher class executives and things like this. But yellow cabs also worked primarily in Manhattan. So I don't know how many of you have been to New York City, but there's sort of Manhattan, this island, and then some outer boroughs that have historically been less wealthy and were more poorly serviced by certainly by yellow cabs. And so in these sort of outer boroughs, you had really, it was like the Wild West. You had what they called at the time, sort of like gypsy cab, just really unregulated folks who would use their own private cars, no licensing. And so the yellow cab industry really came to be seen as sort of the most skilled, most professional kind of these occupations. Also, metered rides. So again, standardized, higher licensing requirements, so on and so forth. And in the 1970s, so this is at sort of kind of early turns towards, at the time in New York, there was a lot of investment in sort of finance, real estate, development, trying to sort of build economic power within the city. And within the taxi industry, what that ended up resulting in was, again, this sort of private transfer of medallions. It ended up that there were a couple of different ways that you could access a medallion. And one was you could be an owner operator, you could own the permit, drive it yourself, and maybe lease it out to someone else for 12 hours a day or so. There were garages where people would come and lease, and the garage would have sort of hundreds of cars. And then some other situations where maybe the driver would own the vehicle and just rent the medallion and sort of stick it on their car and have sort of a longer term lease that way. But in the 1970s, so this is at a time when drivers were still considered employees, there began to be these conversations in the city around sort of private transfer of medallions and, importantly, shifting from an employment status where drivers would keep a portion of what was held on the meter, had things like, a guaranteed minimum wage, so on and so forth, to leasing status, right? Where drivers would pay money upfront at the beginning of the day, and then they would get to keep everything that was on the meter for the rest of the day. And at the time, there was, as Jamie mentioned, sort of this myth of these workers are unorganizable. So these particular clips are from a group that was active in New York City from 1971 to 1977 called the Taxi Rank and File Coalition. And this idea of leasing was commonly called horse hiring, which was sort of referenced back to horse and carriage days and sort of labor processes at that time. And so there was this big campaign around like no horse hiring, right? Horses belong in stables, not in garages. And to sort of read sort of a clip from this top cutout here that I have, they're talking about the shift of risk from garages to workers. Every week we'd have to pay a fixed amount, pay our own gas, regardless of how much we booked and made in tips. On top, having to guarantee the boss's share, we'd have to put up with all the risks, right? Slow days, flat tires, breakdowns, long wait times at the airport. So you can begin to see how drivers are really being asked under this model to shoulder a lot more of the economic risk. And the other feature of this is that as classified as self-employed, drivers then, the union that was there, questionably effective, right? They let this leasing model come in. We could have a long conversation about that. But in the shift to non-standard employment, drivers at the time were also in touch with one another kind of all over North America. They sort of made this comment about the company has obviously hired really smart labor lawyers because the National Labor Relations Act specifically will exclude us under this leasing model from coverage and protections offered by the National Labor Relations Act. So again, that's things like the right to collective bargaining, the right to a minimum wage. And I'll mention one more thing about this, that shortly after the introduction of leasing, there were for a long time also radios in cabs that would sort of dispatch drivers to particular locations. And there was an intentional decision made to remove radios from cars. And one of the things that did was to really disrupt this idea of control, that the garage had control over the driver, was telling them where to go, when to go, and really helped sort of make a stronger case that these people were, these workers were indeed self-employed. And so it was into this context that, this had like particular working conditions that were that came to be associated with the yellow cab industry. So when drivers became self-employed, workplace fragmentation with implications for both their associational and structural power, very long working hours. So again, to go back to this comment in the top, right? It says, at the end of this, it says something to the effect of, to make do, we'll all probably work 12-hour shifts 6 days a week. Well, would you guess it? 12-hour shifts 6 days a week came to be industry standard. By the time that I was working there, that was absolutely par for the course. Health and safety concerns, right? You're not covered by some of these like occupational health and safety protections. Very little control over terms and conditions of work. So, again, this is hyper regulated by New York City. I mean, when and where you can honk your horn, right? I've seen people get tickets for looking at a passenger and not stopping to pick them up, right? People make accusations about they saw me, they made eye contact and they didn't stop, right? So hyper regulated. No benefits, particularly for those in leasing relationships, limited or no ownership over the means of production, cars, vehicles, things like this. Very high lease prices in excess of $100, $150 per 12-hour shift. And so just rampant exploitation. And the particular time that I was doing some of this field work, sort of in 2016, 2017, 2018, overcharges were so common, right? So this is after the Great Recession, right? It was late to hit New York. You had a fall in the number of construction jobs and things like this that were happening, and people began again to flood into the for-hire vehicle industry, right? It's like the 1930s replay. And so with overcharges specifically, I mean, people were being charged late fees for returning the car 5 minutes late. They were being charged early fees. They were being charged extra cleaning fees that seemed to be totally arbitrary. If you wanted a reliable car, people felt like they had to show up hours early, and the dispatcher would say like, well, I can give you a good car if there's something in it for me, right? And so people are sort of shelling out, just money left, right, and center, right? This is just adding. People are starting every day in the red, and this is just adding to it every single day. And so it's really hard to imagine exactly how pervasive this is until you are on the ground there. And the time that I was sort of doing some of this research, you begin to see these settlements for these lease overcharges that were really sort of broker data was collected by the Taxi Workers Alliance, taken to the New York Attorney General, for settlements for drivers, 1.2 million, 1.6 million, $750,000, all over the place. And when I was interviewing drivers about, you know, why did you make the switch to Uber, right? That you really can't understate. It was not just, you know, we talk about Uber, we talk about like, oh, people want to work because of flexibility. People want to work because of, you know, they want to be their own boss. There were also some very significant push factors, right? And when we did the survey, ultimately we found that the average tenure of people in the for-hire vehicle driving industry often exceeded how long Uber had been in the city, which is to say that people were moving from the yellow industry into becoming Uber drivers. People were moving from the unregulated black car industry or sort of gypsy cab industry into becoming Uber drivers. And so when I asked one yellow driver specifically, why did you make this switch? He said the final straw was that one garage, you know, really ripped me off. They gave me this weekly lease at one price. Halfway through the lease, they upped the price, right? And this is someone who had bought their own car, just leased the medallion, right? Paid to put a partition in their car, paid for all of this stuff. And the garage said to him, if you don't like it, you can F off, right? And the driver finally said, okay, fine, I'm out. And so Uber shows up, and for the first time, you know, drivers had these choices of all of these garages, right? I showed you half a dozen newspaper clips, right? Those are your choices. It's like, oh, I can get ripped off at garage 1 or I can get ripped off at garage 2. Like this doesn't feel like much of a choice. And so when Uber came in with all of these incentives, right? And at the time they came in promising that people would make $90,000 a year or whatever, be your own boss. That was really, it felt like a choice for people in some ways for the very first time. And so for this was true for lease drivers specifically. And so what I sort of argued is that like Uber was really seen as because it was seen as a choice, drivers for the first time could exercise their exit option. For those who were choosing between either being a for-hire driver or working at a gas station, which has been, you know, again, sort of low-wage immigrant workforce, you know, credentials often not recognized, that taxi driving can be argued to be a better job than, you know, being a gas station attendant. Weighing your options, right? Uber seemed relatively maybe like a step up, or people were optimistic that it was a step up. But for owner operators, for those who had sort of invested in a medallion, invested in a car, held a mortgage, had payments for that, you know, dumped their life savings into this profession. They were really married to their medallions. And this had a drastic impact on individual owner operators' ability to find someone to drive with, a driving partner. So owner operator would often drive, you know, 6 days a week, 12-hour days. But during the opposite 12-hour shift, they would lease their car out to someone else. And with Uber now present, right, some of those folks who had been partner drivers and things like this began to move to the you know, Uber side of things. And unlike the yellow cab industry, where I talked about this sort of cap on medallions and things like this, there was no cap on Uber, right? So you just began to see more and more and more people. And in anticipation of this you know, sort of meeting workshop today, we had some, between the organizers, some emails back and forth. And one question that came up in that was sort of the need for consumer demand and how do you build that into a market? And because I was sort of there on the ground to watch all of this unfold, I can share with you something that I've never seen it mentioned in any paper or written anywhere. But when Uber first entered New York City, they had integrated yellow cabs into their dispatching infrastructure. So you could hail a yellow cab, right? You could go out on the street and raise your hand and a yellow cab would stop. Or you could get on your phone and you could e-hail an Uber, or you could e-hail a yellow cab. And so consumers began to become really used to sort of opening up their phone, asking for what they wanted, and then having it stop. And the yellow cab, while they were charging money for Uber rides, the yellow cab function was totally free in this like early, you know, application rollout. And this lasted for, you know, a couple of months. I can't tell you exactly how long it lasted. I remember being around for sort of a few months. And then I remember the day that they started charging $2 to dispatch a yellow cab. So again, you could go out on the street, raise your hand for free, New Yorkers like God-given right? Or you could pay Uber $2 to dispatch you a yellow cab that you could otherwise get for free, right? And then very soon after that, they removed yellow cabs completely from their system. And this was by the time that sort of consumers had become really, really used to this idea of being able to use your phone. Well, this didn't last for very long. This sort of optimistic view that drivers had about, you know, the potential that Uber might have presented to them. And very quickly, it sort of turned into taxi 2.0. Long hours, decreases in earnings, right? These same unilateral changes that were being made, high levels of surveillance, many of the things that Jamie mentioned, sort of deactivation with no, you know, cause, no ability to contest it. You know, this notional flexibility that drivers could choose their hours, but in fact, you know, so much research at this point has showed that, you know, it's driven by demand. And so people end up working asocial hours, or the company will create bonuses that make people stay on longer and, you know, nudge their behavior towards certain different things. But on top of all of these things that had been really more or less present in the yellow cab industry for a long time, you also had this massive, massive oversupply of drivers. So in 2014, there were 10,000 black cars, and that was the sort of subsector of the for-hire vehicle industry that Uber came into. By 2018, you can see here, nearly 110,000 vehicles. So some folks, New York City has this amazing data set for taxi cab, for everything. They've made a commitment to like open data, big data. And some people have looked at this and have been able to sort of measure that the average speed on the road in New York City has decreased, right? The average speed at which people move. But you think about, you know, you add another 100,000 cars to the, like this super tight gridlock system. And it's sort of easy to imagine how this would have serious repercussions on working conditions for everybody in the sector. And on top of that, drivers owning a car, right, to drive for Uber, I will call it like a near, and have often called it a near requisite, right? So drivers, in order to drive for Uber, were being encouraged to buy cars. Uber was helping them to finance cars early on, was helping to broker these types of arrangements. And so on one hand, at the New York Taxi Workers Alliance, sort of in the sort of research that I was doing there, we would get these calls from these desperate medallion owners who, because of features of supply and demand, the price of their medallion, which had been, you know, $1.5 million when I started doing this research, had declined to like $200,000, right? There's this sort of graph from the New York Times down there at the bottom. And actually the New York Times reporting on this subsequently received a Pulitzer Prize. You know, it was sort of really, really great. You know, I had been sort of working towards writing these academic papers and chapters and things like this, but, you know, to really sort of bring this story to the public, it was, they've done some really fantastic reporting on it, and I encourage you all to read it. But because the New York Taxi Workers Alliance was receiving calls from desperate drivers, you know, the office was open until 2 o'clock in the morning. Like when you have a 24-hour workforce, you keep strange hours. And to be having meetings at 4 o'clock in the morning or at 2 o'clock in the morning, just with people who were so incredibly desperate, who were, you know, losing their medallions, losing their homes, that they decided that what they wanted to do was to start this debt relief campaign. And they were finding that it wasn't just yellow cab drivers, though, that were really adversely affected by this. It was so easy for Uber drivers to enter into the market, but exercising their exit option, as it turned out, was much more difficult than getting in. Getting out was much more difficult. And, you know, so in the survey that we had done, we sort of asked a number of questions that were specifically about about sort of workers' financial health and well-being generally. And, you know, 3/4 are saying that they agree or strongly agree that Uber has negatively affected their ability to earn a livable income. And these are Uber drivers themselves, right? They got on the platform because they felt optimistic about it. And then sort of fast forward a couple of years and they're saying, no, this is really an untenable situation. And the particular figure here that is really striking to me is this 82% who agreed or, and again, this was sort of I think our sample of app-based drivers was over 300, agreed or strongly agreed that they were driving more hours and earning the same amount of money or less. And why this is particularly striking to me is that Uber over the past couple of years has hired sort of really high-flying academics at places like University of Chicago or Princeton to do research with some of their administrative and survey data. And there was a paper which sort of cited that drivers love to be their own bosses, so on and so forth. But I had written a published response to that. And so in the process of this, received their survey materials. They asked the same question in the survey. They had similar findings and they never reported them, right? That drivers were working more and earning the same amount or less. And that really, I think, says something about business model expansion strategy, and also sort of how they're trying to cultivate public opinion, right? Having their consumers call their lobby, to lobby on behalf of them, getting these academics to publish in peer-reviewed journals, which are being used by transport regulators to make decisions in other places. So back to this sort of exit voice loyalty and neglect. What does this mean? Well, debt restricts the range of possible responses, right? And few people distinguish between the apps. I've said Uber a number of times, but in fact, conditions are really no different on something like Lyft. And in the time, during this research, there was Get, there was Juno, there were, all of these other apps as well. And few distinguish between the apps. And part of this has to do with this idea of loyalty. So there really isn't a sense of loyalty. Most drivers, and this was like 75% of our sample, were working on more than one app. And there are a couple of reasons for this. One, major apps had such a huge market share, right, that people couldn't afford to not work on them. But also people couldn't necessarily afford to only work on one. And so there wasn't really like loyalty to one particular app. Neglect was the pervasive sentiment. So throughout this time, the New York Taxi Workers Alliance are sort of continuing to organize, continuing to try to like press the city for some sort of response. Having the Taxi and Limousine Commissioner, the head of this regulatory body, come to their office to hear directly from drivers. And the city just didn't have any response. And part of this had to do with like conflict between the city government and this upstate government, and sort of issues around regulation and jurisdiction, and, again, sort of consumers weighing in. I mean, there was de Blasio at one point said, we're going to cap the numbers, and recanted on this like within days after his office had been overwhelmed by Uber users, right? Consumers of the service, and their policy budget, or sort of, it's just like unbelievable. So many drivers sort of came to adopt the sentiment of like, this is a direct quote, as soon as I pay my car off, I'm going to get out, right? They were trapped by their car payments. It's really expensive to have a car in New York City. It's also a total hassle to have a car in New York City unless you're driving it all the time. And so this was really the case until February 2018, when it became clear that neglecting the situation, that just was untenable. And part of that has to do with Douglas Shifter, who was a driver in New York City, long tenure, wrote for the Industry magazine, professional driver. He had worked in the industry for decades. And he said there was always meant to be a number of cars below demand. And if you think back to that sort of 1937 Haas Act, where they introduced medallion prices, that's true. That was a guarantee of a steady income. Now politicians have flooded the streets with unlimited cars, some 3,000 new ones every month still coming. There is not enough work for everyone that pays a living. This is slavery now. They are destroying many thousands of families. And at this point, this man, his car had broken down twice. He was in debt. He wasn't sure how he was going to get out of the situation. And the last thing he said in this sort of public Facebook post was, I hope with the public sacrifice I make now that some attention, it will bring some attention to the plight of drivers. And he drove himself to city council and he ended his life with a shotgun on the steps. And this was absolutely devastating. And part of why this was so incredibly devastating is because this was the first of a rash of driver suicides. I mean, it was like every week for like a month and a half after this, right? I think the number reached like 8 or 9 drivers that ended their lives. And this was in all sectors, right? These were app-based driver, like he was a black car driver, right? That's the same sector that Uber was operating in. There were yellow cab drivers who owned medallions, who were, trapped by these, what had become toxic assets that they had. And so this really made it so that like the New York Taxi Workers Alliance response was like, today we mourn and tomorrow we organize. That is our only way out of this, is to really push for regulation. We need to curb the number of workers that are on the street. And much in the same way that, this was not sort of an Uber problem necessarily and specifically, it was an industry problem. And so what the approach was to develop sort of an industry, sort of sector-wide solution. And that meant that, and this hasn't always sort of played out the same way in different parts of the world, right? How unions or organized workers or workers in traditional sector respond to, new entrants, right? Some people organize in a way that's very defensive and tries to keep workers out. And the New York Taxi Workers Alliance looked around and said, look, people who are driving for Uber, they used to be yellow cab drivers. These are, people who we know from our communities, from the mosque, from, our kids go to school together. And we need unity across the sector. And so drivers were really able to come together, realizing that implementing a vehicle cap, which started for 1 year but has since been extended, and also implementing a sector-wide wage rate that was pegged to the yellow cab industry, right? Where one wasn't going to underbid the other, was really, really, really essential for ensuring that drivers broadly were able to work with some dignity. But this question of debt still looms really large, and these are some of the clips that were specifically related to this kind of Pulitzer Prize reporting that was done around sort of debt and how the city was really complicit with this and how financial institutions were complicit in this. And so to think back to sort of this like first picture that I showed just from last September, we served and believed, New York City and the banks lied and deceived. I mean, you can really see how drivers through the history of this, that COVID, something like COVID, which has driven down ridership, right? Driven down because of how risk is structured in this industry, has really just exacerbated what have been very, very, very long-standing problems. So there have been questions now around like are taxi cab drivers considered essential workers, right? They're not public sector workers. They again are private sector, but they are offering a public good, and they're really exposed. I mean, this is one of the most dangerous industries you can work in pre-COVID, right? It is extremely violent industry. Your likelihood to be murdered on the job is higher than just about any other industry. Yeah, and so there are sort of new risks that are emerging, but I think one of the challenges like related to COVID is that Whereas this had sort of been gaining some traction early on, COVID has affected so many industries and so many workers and the school system and the public health system, and has overwhelmed the hospital system. And the way it has been handled, I'm also a US citizen, so I can sort of speak to this, but has been terrible, right? And so it's not just, it's no longer just driver, like the spotlight is no longer just on drivers around this question of debt relief, because regulators are stretched increasingly thin. But as we saw sort of from that first picture, you know, drivers are continuing to organize, and they have, you know, very clear things that they're asking for. And right now, debt relief for the traditional regulated sector is at the top of the list. And so I'm going to end there. Thanks.
Great, thank you both very much. We will now have a 10 minutes break.
Okay, well, first of all, thank you very much, Jamie and Hannah, for your presentations. Now we will open the debate to the participants. I don't know if Tommaso, perhaps you want to begin. I have questions. I know Lorenza has questions. So what do you prefer?
Please go ahead, and I will comment on that later.
Okay. I will just ask one question. That is something that has been going on my mind for a while now. It's on the viability of the Uber model and of platform work. What do I mean? In a certain way, Uberization is not something that's new. What I'm saying is that auto-employment has been rather omnipresent in the history of capitalism. It has existed in metalwork in Europe in the 19th century. It has existed in clerical work in early 20th century. It has existed in late 20th century in industrial work, etc. In a certain way, as Jamie said, we have perhaps focused too much on the novel aspect of platform work. At the same time, platform work today doesn't concern that many people. There isn't a consensus on this subject, but estimates go in between 1% and 6 or 7% of the workforce, depending on the country. So is then platform work a NEPI phenomenon, something that will not last or that will remain marginal? That is my question. I don't know if I'm clear. Excuse my English, I'm sorry. That is my question. Perhaps I have other questions later, but I don't know if Lorenza, you want to continue. I'll just post a small article I wrote for Jacobin on this subject, saying that that precariousness is not something new, and Uberization can be understood in this long history of precarious work under capitalism.
I propose we collect some questions before, and then we move back to our speakers.
Okay, can I, Seb? And then we have people that are already booked and they're raise their hands.
Go ahead.
So I have 3 points. So I'll try to be brief. So reflecting on the issue of whether regulation is possible, I was thinking of two aspects that possibly complicate the picture. So one thing is that, and that both pertain to the social dynamics around the Uber sector. So on the one hand, the stratification, that it is not always linear where you have the driver and the platform. I mean, this question that Hannah has stressed as well about the lease, the question of the lease and the ownership, gives rise to a situation that I've seen, for example, in South Africa a lot, where you often have a mid layer of car owners that are a private layer of those that rent the car out, and therefore that perhaps either are those registered with the platform and the worker, the driver, does not exist anywhere, or they are themselves not registered anywhere, because often they belong to a sort of criminality network. So this makes the situation complicated and more multi-layered, and certainly makes, I think, proves the question of self-employment wrong, because not only you have a working relationship between the driver and the platform, but you have a double attachment of the driver to the car owner and to the platform. So it's clearly not a free freelance kind of situation, even more. So this is one thing that I wanted to hear if you have observed this in your cases. The other issue is the relationship, the often conflictual relationship between the regular taxi drivers industry and Uber drivers. That is very complicated. Sometimes it assumes the aspect of an external lobby, like for example in Italy, where the Uber sector has never really thrived because the the regular taxi drivers strongly defend their privileges and the license that they paid costly. So there is a sort of defending the lobby. Sometimes it becomes open conflict. In South Africa, regular taxi drivers, you remember, Jamie, they used to attack Uber drivers, but really in a violent way. Or it has the aspect like in London, where, for example, I remember there was a dispute over the congestion tax exemption between the black taxi drivers and Uber drivers. So this often complicates the possibility of enacting regulations, because there's external interest that puts a lot of pressure. So this is something that if maybe you want to articulate in relation to other cases, I don't know, but I think affects the regulation issue. And the other thing that I wanted to ask relates to, again, to COVID. I mean, on one side, we've seen Uber becoming like this large pool, like a large employer of last resort. On the other side, it also becomes a necessity of the customers in a moment where transport, public transport is so dangerous. So my question is, besides these dynamics that we've all observed, but do we have any data on whether COVID has caused an enlargement of the industry? Possibly. But do we have any data on whether, for example, the number of drivers has increased, to what extent across countries? Although it could be early, but can we already rely on some evidence on this? Thank you.
Thank you. I don't know if you want to begin answering, or Tommaso, perhaps. No? What do you prefer?
Okay, I think I will complement your question, and so I will try to develop some of the ideas I've sent by email to Anna and Jamie, also explain why I developed things and so provide some information about GERPISA and why from which angle we are developing interest on these issues. So in GERPISA, there is kind of a long tradition of work on car companies, as you can imagine. So we developed an analysis in terms of productive models, and the key elements in that was the profitability. So when we look historically at these car companies, we look how they made money, and we concluded that if a car company is managed to be regularly profitable, probably has developed a viable productive model. And so we started to characterize what is a viable productive model, and we developed the notion of the compromise of government between stakeholders as a conditions for profitability. So this was written by the founder of the GERPISA network, Michel Fresnay, together with an economist from the Regulationary School, Robert Boyer, in the early 2000s. So when we start to look at Uber, we started to do it because it was presented as the future business model for the auto industry to a certain extent, as the auto industry now wants to move towards mobility as a service, as a new business for them. And they say that they claim to be providers of mobility. We started to look at Uber, and we were very surprised to see that even if this is a global business, very well known everywhere, and then it's now even in the stock market, it keeps losing money. And by losing money, we mean by big. I mean, because the revenue of Uber is not the gross revenues. The gross revenues is what they get from the people who pay Uber, but they have to give back the money to the driver. So the net revenues are the fees. And on the fees, they lose 80%. So they have a minus 80% profit rates. And so if a car makers had that just in 1 year, it would go bankrupt, and that's it. And that's the end of the story. So that is intriguing for us. As I told you, I tried to dig into the question, understand first why Uber lose money, because on the paper, it seems like a very smart idea. You're just an intermediate. You just connect a driver and a customer, and you take a fee out of that. So how can you lose the money since you don't own anything? You don't pay for the social security of the workers. You don't hire anybody. So why this company lose money since it basically owns nothing and has huge business? So that is an intriguing question. So I just throw in the mail to you some hypotheses, which is perhaps is because you need to continually attract drivers, so you overpay them in respect of much you pay to. You ask the people to pay for the service you offer. So you hire constantly. You need to hire workers, and then at the same time you need to attract customers. And so since you are in competition with other platforms, you always undersell your service. And eventually, to make the things briefly, is that it seems that there is not enough value in the service that is given to make the business work, in the sense that why the cab industry was regulated? Well, it was because that if you let unregulated, in the end, nobody earns enough money for living. So it seems like the Uber business model is a sort of a kind of impossible one, because there is no enough value, and they unregulate the business, and eventually they try to get money out of that. And this creates perhaps the reason why class struggle emerged as the inevitable outcome of this business model. It's just eventually they try to get value out of their drivers, but there is not enough value. And so that ends up in this class struggle that is being clearly emphasized by Jamie in a very, I think, interesting way to go back to E. Thompson. I think that was a very nice idea. This is really like we see a new transnational working class, and Uber can't help them to get the consciousness of the fact that they are all in the same situation. So it's kind of consciousness of class emerged out of this homogenization of working condition made possible by the platform economy. So that was the kind of thinking that brought to the question I asked you in the email. So I was just re-putting that on the table to have your thinking about that. So eventually, perhaps the regulation could be a way out for Uber. I remember talking with Thomas Clear from the Federal Bank of Chicago about the cap in New York, and he told me perhaps that's the condition under which Uber will finally be profitable. And he didn't elaborate a lot about that, so I'm not sure exactly what didn't mean. But I thought that perhaps there is something about that this business is only viable when it's regulated. Is there perhaps something that we can think about it as, I don't know, that re-embedding Uber is the only way to save Uber from just going bankrupt? It's kind of provocative thinking. Then you didn't talk about the California vote. So I didn't follow that very close. What would have meant if the Uber and the other had lost? Actually, they didn't lose, that they won. and what they've won. I mean, is that new status that has been voted in California a very bad thing, good thing? How does it change things? So if you could tell us a little bit about that. And I think that for me, that's all. And I just wanted to explain the perspective of JRPs on these issues historically. Hope it's clear.
Do you want to start, Chad?
Yeah, happy to. I mean, I think the first question is a really important one. The question of how new this is, and I hope I didn't come across as somebody saying that everything is new, everything has changed, because I'm very much not a fan of much of the arguments around the gig economy that talk about this as a fundamentally new form of work. You know, from looking out of my window here in East London, you can see the gasworks. Well, they're no longer gasworks, of course. They're surrounded by fancy new housing, but you can see where the docks used to be. You know, these were areas of incredibly precarious work for a long period of time in London. And so I definitely don't think that platform work is a kind of entirely new thing. I actually have a slightly different answer to this question, though, which is that what I do think is new is the speed with which workers have begun to organize in a new industry. And I think perhaps if we look at the automobile industry, if we look at the emergence of car factories whether in the UK or elsewhere, is it often takes not necessarily a generation of workers, but it often takes a series of cycles of struggle, of longer periods of time, for workers to find modes of struggle, to build collective organization. And I guess in a strange way, the argument that I have tried to make, and maybe I could have made that a bit more explicit, is what is interesting about this is how quickly platform workers have taken action, have built networks, have formed new organizations. So really the new thing that we should focus on is, how does this happen so quickly? And my argument is, in a sense, that the communication technology, rather than being something that is introducing new forms of precarity to this workforce, actually allows many of these workers to do things quicker than they might have done otherwise. And I think the problem with this, of course, is that the platforms want to say it's new. So, you know, we have huge arguments about how novel all of this is and how different it is. But I also want to give one small anecdote. So from time to time in the UK, I get invited to things with representatives from platforms that speak. And Deliveroo in the UK, much like with Uber, have quite a close connection with the Conservative Party in the UK, the ruling party. People who have been senior employees, because of course Uber do have some employees, you know, they have policy lobbyists and so on in London. They have quite a large team of employees that do this thing, go and work for the Conservative Party and vice versa. So there's a lot of kind of exchange between those people. And one of them said something in a meeting I was in that I think sums up why this work is important. Because I think the first question is right, that numerically this work is quite small. Not everybody is going to become an Uber driver. Not everybody's work is going to become Uberized. But one of the Deliveroo advisors said actually the same thing. He said that, you know, Deliveroo is not really about Deliveroo. Deliveroo is about how all work is changing. And his argument was that social security in the UK now has to change because we have more people working for platforms like Deliveroo or Uber, and that new technology has shown that unemployment benefit, that the ways that social security is organized must change in the UK. And he was quite clear that the changes of work for this small number of people is part of a wider project of Uberizing social security, of other kinds of work and so on. And I think that's why it's important, not because it's a new kind of mass figure of working class experience necessarily, but that it's a testing ground for techniques that are going to reshape other people's work, not necessarily directly in the same way that they are on a platform like Uber, but testing out new techniques and also trying to reorganize the state in various ways. And And put it this way, the government people who were in this meeting were very taken by this. They were like, oh, this is so exciting. We're going to, do something new and strip away unemployment benefit, and won't we be seen as, the cutting edge of policy and so on. So they do kind of take on these arguments in a number of ways. I think to answer some of Lorenzo's questions, I think the point about different relationships that drivers have is a very important one, which I think Hannah has brought out in the New York case study very well. And I was very surprised in South Africa to hear that lots of people had these additional relationships with people that loaned them a car and so on. So talking to drivers who would start the week with negative money, have to pay off the fee to the car owner first. I think there are a number of these predatory relationships that platforms like Uber have built upon. I remember a story also from India where Uber had pushed very hard to create financing arrangements for migrant workers. So encouraged people to sell family land in order to buy a car, and facilitated that relationship with a promise of incredibly high wages and so on, which the driver got for the first month or two. And then it began to decline, and suddenly they were making no more money. So I think debt relationships play quite an important role in trapping people on these platforms. And in part, this is because the platform can otherwise struggle to compel workers to continue working on the platform. They don't have the traditional means of control of an employment contract. And so often debt is used as a way to keep people working on these platforms. And I think it's a significant difference in the UK or in other states. In the UK, if Uber continued to do subprime car loan lending, it would make them look much more like an employer. So they first had an arm's length company, and now they have another company that does this. So they kind of moved this debt relationship away from the platform. They're still very much involved in it though. In terms of the relationship between taxi drivers and platform workers, again, I think this is an important part of whilst platforms are internationalized, they have distinctly national characteristics in the places that they operate in. One of these is the relationship with the state, what they can get away with looking like an employment relationship or not, how they are licensed and so on. But I think also the relationship with taxi drivers is very important. So in the UK, for example, the existing taxi drivers, many of whom are unionized in a mainstream trade union, have attempted to exclude Uber drivers from the labor movement quite deliberately. And some of this has come out in terms of how regulation has been determined. So Lorenzo mentioned a congestion charge. So in London, you have to pay a fee to drive in the city. There was significant lobbying to have existing taxi drivers not pay this fee, but have Uber drivers pay the fee. And parts of the labor movement lobbied for this, to have a section of the workforce have to pay this fee, and it eventually went through. So you have these kind of conflictual relationships with other forms of work. In the UK is incredibly racialized. The existing taxis are something like 95% white British, whereas Uber drivers are something like 93% Black and minority ethnic. So there's a very clear racial distinction that's played upon there. And as Lorenzo knows, in South Africa, the risk of violence from existing taxi drivers to Uber drivers is a kind of constant problem for Uber drivers. And I think this is one of the things that's worth drawing attention to with this work, is in the nighttime economy, these kinds of work are often very dangerous forms of work. People are at risk of road accidents, robberies, violence, and so on. And if you're an Uber driver, you're often not protected by the state in similar ways. You know, if you're a migrant worker or you're racialized, you're much less likely to be able to use the police, for example, as a method to ameliorate some of that. So I think these things are important parts of the national context for making sense of it. I want to say two more things. I realize I've said, I'm trying to fit quite a lot of answers in perhaps, but I think we don't really know what the impact of COVID is quite yet on this workforce, other than, at least in the UK, taxi drivers are one of the most at-risk professions, alongside hospital cleaners and so on, and have had hugely high rates of infection. I know many Uber drivers that are suffering from COVID and long COVID and are losing income because they can't work. And I think what we may see is many people exit from driving for Uber because they have had a period of non-work long enough that their car has been repossessed, that they don't have enough money to get back into the work, essentially. And I think what we're seeing in the UK is many people pushed out of Uber driving and into food delivery because it has lower overheads. You can get a bicycle and deliver food. You don't need a license and so on. So there's an increasing number of older workers beginning to deliver food who I think previously, I don't have the evidence for this, but I think previously many of them were Uber drivers. So kind of shifting around as people are forced out of this work because there's no protection for them when they suffer from COVID. Then finally on Tommaso's point, I mean, I think the interesting thing with Uber is that the business model can't be separated from the amount of capital investment that's been made onto the platform. This completely skews whether or not we can consider it as profitable or not. And as an example, I spoke to a platform operator in South Africa that had almost no capital investment. They'd set up a platform in one city, and they were making lots of money. They didn't collect data because they couldn't afford the server fees to collect the data and store it and so on. But they paid drivers less than it cost them to charge the customer to deliver something. And they were making lots of money because they had a very simple business model, which goes back to the kind of central way that capital extracts value, right? They just had a simple model, they did it, they made money. The difficulty is there's often a discussion that there are only 4 profitable cities for Uber, and maybe Hannah can correct me on. I think it's Sao Paulo, London, San Francisco, and New York. Maybe there's another one.
I think there's 5, but I can't remember.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah, there's a number that are kind of talked about as being profitable cities. And in part, the challenge about this is the amount of money that Uber has spent to compete in London makes it hard to tell how much money or how profitable the service can be in London. I would often talk to drivers who were telling me that they were paid significantly more than I was paying for the journey because Uber were trying to build a user base and so on. Add to this the lobbying costs. Uber is spending a phenomenal amount of money on lobbying. That really it wasn't meant to be a profitable business model. It's aiming for a monopoly and then to extract monopoly rents on the basis of it. But I think one of the things we have to be clear about, and I get quite kind of frustrated by some of the arguments around data with Uber, that Uber's not interested in profiting from the kind of individual relationships, but the really valuable thing is the data. And that's why they're able to spend so much money. There's no evidence that Uber are going to be able to make money from that data. And in fact, have wound up their autonomous vehicle division after spending huge quantities of money on it. And I worry about it because the logic of that argument is, well, the drivers don't really matter. It's just the data that's being generated that's of interest. So it kind of shifts the analysis away from the actual relationship that's happening and says, well, workers aren't important anymore. It's just geolocation data. And whenever I hear that argument, I think of this South African platform that said, we just delete the data because it's of no value. We know where people order things from and go from and so on. So I think there's a question of how valuable that data really is. People buy pizzas in the evening in London. They buy them in residential neighborhoods. It's not kind of magic that kind of data that's involved there. There are things around how often people do it and so on, but it's not the really valuable thing that's being generated there. So hopefully that addresses some of the questions.
Yeah, I guess I don't have too much to add. That I hope that in tying sort of the present conditions back to this kind of historical story of taxi work in New York, it's drives home the point that it's been a precarious industry for a long time, and that's why this business model has taken off there. I mean, I think as far as worker organizing goes, it feels unsurprising to me then that some of the models of worker organizing that have been effective are those which have long been used with workers who are engaged in precarious work. That you know, domestic workers, where there has also been a proliferation of sort of app-based work, that their sort of alliances and worker centers and things like this have figured out how to respond to this, where day laborers have capitalized on some of this technology to bring workers together, and that a group like the New York Taxi Workers Alliance, which has been working with drivers since the 90s, would be well prepared to sort of draw on its network and strategies that are not dependent on employee status to figure out a way to improve wages and working conditions, irregardless. So one other thing, I guess, to add to Lorenza, your note about this sort of mid-layer, when I was at the ILO has a forthcoming global report on digital labor platforms, which looks at a number of sectors. And in the course of that, we had sort of worked with colleagues in country offices in a number of locations. And in addition to sort of this sort of middle, who owns the capital, right? Like who owns the car, who owns the medallion, what are these relationships? What I was very surprised to hear is that there are also a number of regions where drivers may be working even with a cell phone or ID on these platforms that is not their own. So, you know, for a driver that may not even have a phone, that they could work under my account, or, you know, I could sort of hire out people, have these sort of artificial accounts and to enter into some of these more complex relationships that way. And that in turn, right, that there's also a cut of money that's taken there, right? If it's deposited into my account and I turn around and take a cut of that and pay someone even less. So, and I think that is part of, you know, a lot of the research that's been done so far has tended to be in the global north. And so understanding what, you know, Jamie's examples of India or both of your examples of South Africa are really valuable for that reason, to look also at industries that have been maybe not terribly well regulated to begin with, and because how things unfold in that context can be quite different. I mean, in terms of sort of conflict-ridden relationships, that's also a very old story. You know, how unions respond, whether they approach things inclusively or not. And I think that there are other industries that we could point to around sort of temporary agency workers or whatever that have seemed to suggest that maybe in the short term, that kind of exclusionary politics can be effective for keeping people out. But just as workers can be very creative with their organizing drives, we should not underestimate the desires and interests of capital to figure out ways to, you know, find legal loopholes and circumvent existing regulation and whatever to divide workers. And so I think one of the things that I feel should be celebrated about the New York Taxi Workers Alliance really was its ability to reach across this divide and to unite workers throughout the sector. That the impact of Uber was not only on, you know, it didn't just negatively impact Uber drivers, it negatively impacted taxi drivers. It's negatively impacted the public transportation system because of this 50-cent charge that I have, you know, mentioned. That like just the fallout, it has a ripple effect. And in terms of COVID, the postdoc that I'm currently working on, we're doing, continue to do some platform research on a number of different types of platforms, including things like food delivery and shopping, which has seen a dramatic increase in terms of the number of people who are, you know, going to grocery stores, doing shopping, and then delivering people their groceries, so that those who are willing and able to pay have less exposure to the virus. And I guess, so I can just say sort of from that we have found it more difficult to recruit Uber drivers at a time when people are not moving as much, right? That even like it has had an impact on demand also. And so drivers who are accustomed to multi-homing or working on a number of platforms are finding themselves not only working on a number of different types of platforms, but doing a number of different types of platform work. And Uber specifically has really made this quite easy by integrating Uber Eats into its app so that workers can seamlessly toggle between one and the other. So that's, you know, I don't think there's sort of data on that yet, but it's something certainly that, that we have seen in the US and specifically in the Boston area. Yeah, I mean, this question around sort of the profitability, like I can't really, I think Jamie's points around, financial investments and kind of speculative investment and things like this is really, really important. I mean, if this is something you're interested in, I would really recommend an article written by, his name is Hubert Horan, who looked at sort of, you know, the PR strategies and essentially makes this argument that it's really, it's not profitable. It's not profitable unless you're a monopoly. And then it's sort of this bait and switch. How many people can you get onto the platform and then change working conditions so that it maybe perhaps is profitable at some point? Yeah, these questions are, I mean, the debate around sort of data and the usefulness of data, I think are very interesting. And I'm interested in them from sort of a different perspective, which is to say that if it's all about data, then aren't we all workers in that we are all generating this data? You know, I think probably the most use that I have actually seen that have is with city regulators and transport regulators about knowing kind of the infrastructure, and Uber now has such a remarkable database around where people move and how they move. And again, that's data that's generated not only from a specific ride, but as long as you have the app on. So it really begins to blur this question of when are you working or when are you producing value for this corporation and when are you not? And but I think, you know, the scale and scope of that as a potentially profitable avenue for them is really unknown. And then I guess finally on this question of AB5, so there have been in the States a number of different initiatives to try to provide platform workers with more rights and protections. And the New York City Taxi Workers Alliance for a very, very long time has taken this route of impacting like the administrative rulemaking processes. So this has been to do things like introduce a driver's bill of rights or to extend protections around like, for example, New York City in transport regulation has some rules that if you assault a bus driver, right, there are additional fines that can be faced. So like extending those to taxi drivers as important providers of the public service of transportation and transportation servicing. So, so New York City Taxi Workers Alliance has done this sort of avenue of impacting administrative rulemaking, and because that has some level of enforceability there. In Seattle, a number of years ago, they tried to create some additional rules that if you were an independent contractor, you could form a union. That got really held up in litigation, never really came to fruition. And so sort of learning from that, what California did, which was the context for AB5, was to think about how we define employees and to really sort of expand that definition to also include people who are working for apps through this sort of, you know, employment status has always been kind of evaluated through a checklist, but to kind of simplify this and make it more easily attainable by workers. And the response to this was a $186 million campaign by Uber and Lyft and other platforms to try to get a ballot measure on the ballot in November, where the public had the right then to vote on whether or not certain drivers, specifically those working on these kinds of apps and things like that, would be carved out of this AB5 legislation, so essentially to overturn it. And you know, when you have these sort of small, relatively small worker centers, sort of underfunded worker organizing initiatives, you know, understaffed and overworked, and you have this massive corporation with this massive budget, it's really an uphill battle. And unfortunately, the Proposition 22, which overturned sort of these elements of AB 5 and protections that they would have offered, ultimately passed. And so workers are sort of left in the same position that they were left in initially. But the whole conversation around AB5 has started some conversations in other states like New Jersey, like New York, about how they might begin to introduce sort of similar, you know, regulation that's kind of inspired by that approach. So yeah, thanks.
Thank you very much. I saw a lot of hands raised. I don't know if it was first Samuel Klebaner and then Mike Smitka. What do you prefer? Well, let's give the floor to Mike.
I'll jump in.
Yes, go ahead, please.
So sort of three different aspects of this issue. And my background, along with reading a lot of what's easily available. So, you know, Hubert Horan has 23 parts out now on naked capitalism, which goes well beyond his one published legal publication. And then I did interviews in the Philippines with drivers for Grab. I was planning on having a lot more interviews done at this point, but I haven't been able to get back to the Philippines for obvious reasons. And then I take part in off-the-record conversations organized by a consulting company called BWG that includes someone who is retired from the New York City Taxi Commission. It includes the largest limo fleet owner in New York. It includes an Orlando, Florida taxi company owner. It includes Uber drivers and on and on. So it gets a very diverse set of perspectives. On the driver end of things, one of the things that stands out is that there are two classes of drivers who have very different motives in entering the market. There are the full-time drivers who is implicitly what's been discussed today. But there's also a large contingent of part-time drivers who do it, you know, 1 or 2 days a week or only during certain time slots. One of the people I interviewed in the Philippines was a retired taxi driver, 22 years. And because he really knew what to do, he could drive part day and earn good money. So there's this mix of drivers, and it feeds into the business model side. A second thing is there's incredible turnover. At the end of 1 year, the data that I've looked at is that only about 7% of drivers have ended up driving for 12 months. So it's 40 and 50% turnover a month, which is a huge cost for Uber and Lyft and the companies that have a similar business model because they have overhead for recruiting drivers that comes from trying to play this precarity game. In terms of the transportation side, one of the things that Uber was able to do is because they could have lots and lots of drivers available, you could, in many cities, you know, open up your phone and have a car there within 5 minutes. You know, I lived in New York City. When I needed a cab, I could call and get one to pick me up at a given time. But if I wanted to stand on a corner or, you know, pick up a cab on short notice, then it was always a challenge. And because they have a large number of drivers available, Uber and Lyft and their peers have been able to overcome that component. And so they offer a different sort of transportation service that historically taxi cabs were unable to meet. I could go on at some length about profitability, but I've gone through the financial statements of Yandex, which is based in not Soviet Union, I'm showing my age, in Russia. And both their financial statements and then a seminar I was in with an executive from Yandex, they claim that they are making fairly good money operating in the ride-hailing business. But there are a number of things behind that. One of the distinctive things about Uber is that they were trying to sell themselves as a growth stock. And in order to do that, they were willing to lose a large amount of money. Well, basically they are shrinking rather than growing. And that part of that is because there are transportation niches that they turn out not to be able to handle. One of those, for example, are rides to hospitals and for people with kidney problems to dialysis centers. Those need to be done on a regular basis. And cab companies have actually started expanding from a very low base. Essentially, cab companies were wiped out totally in San Francisco, but in many smaller cities, Uber has gotten a very bad reputation because they're just not reliable. They have a lot of shady characters. They have people with very bad driving records, people who had just been fired by regular taxi companies. So hospitals, when they want to have a reliable service on hand where they know the drivers will be helpful, traditional taxi companies are finding they're able to jump into this and pick up some business. So, one perspective is to think about transportation services and what Uber can and can't do, what they're doing differently. One is to think about them as a business model, and you don't want to hear an hour-long lecture from me on that. And then the other is to note that there are some other types of drivers for whom this precarity is actually desirable because they don't approach it as a way to make a living. It's something to get them. The one driver was 70 something and that I interviewed, and his wife had passed away. And so he wanted to get out of the house every day. And because he knew the business so well, he was making a fair amount of cash. It wasn't enough to live totally, but he had savings. He was able to meet his car payments. And so, he loved being able to do it part-time. But, that's not every Uber driver or Lyft driver. And for the people who are trying to do it, it's very challenging. Maybe a fourth point. New York City has had this swing back and forth. If they grant too many taxi medallions, which is effectively what Uber has done, then taxi drivers aren't able to make money. And there's essentially no way out of that. If they issue too few medallions, then we see the pre-Uber situation where the value of this monopoly is so high that the workers can't afford to own a medallion. And then there's this area in between where the medallions are in reach of drivers. That would have been the situation in the 1970s, early 80s. So can make a good living. The challenge then is that if you live outside of central Manhattan, you can't get a cab. So Queens, if I didn't call ahead, if I needed to get to the airport, I needed to call a day or 2 days in advance to make sure I had a ride there. And of course in Manhattan, if it was a Friday evening and it suddenly began to snow, good luck. But that's to some extent true even with Uber. Okay, sorry to go on at such length.
Thank you, don't worry. I know there are too many people that want to ask questions. I know that also that Jamie needs to leave at 5 p.m. tops. Is that right? No. So go ahead, Jamie, then Hannah, and perhaps if we have more time, we can ask the last two persons can ask their questions. I'm sorry.
Well, perhaps let's give more time. I mean, let's collect some questions. Please try to be quick, and then we give back the words to
If you want to ask questions, you have to be very short, so Jamie can answer them and then leave.
Yeah, I suggest to
Go
do
ahead,
that way. Yeah, just
Holger.
ask very quick question, please, and Sebastian, you stop them when you really see that the time is running over, and then
Yes.
we give back the final word to our speaker.
I kicked them out of the Zoom meeting.
Okay, I think you asked me to ask the question and do it very, very quickly. I was very fascinated by the speed of how quickly the Uber taxi drivers were organizing themselves in the presentation by Jamie. And my question is, are these, so the strikes, for instance, the organized actions, are they local, are they regional, are they national, or are they already some kind of transnational actions taken? So that's my question. Thank you very much.
And Stefan wants to ask one last question.
Yeah, thank you very much, Hannah, for your presentation. Just one thing is about the disruption, whether Uber can disrupt the car industry. We know we have high fixed costs in the car industry. And according to Moore's law, being in the software industry, we think that if we can shift away from these costs, that might greatly disrupt the industry. I know it's a bit, it was not the point of your presentation, but I would like you to know, to develop a bit more about what do you think about Uber's being able to change the rules of the game in the car industry, or you think all those employment conditions might just be like, just say there is nothing that might change here? That's a very short question. Thank you.
You can go ahead, Jamie, Hannah.
Okay. So a couple of things to say. I mean, I think it's an important question, this one of part-time and full-time drivers. And I think, again, goes to this issue of the national differences, right? I think in the US, and Hannah can probably speak more to this than I can, but there is certainly in some parts of the US, a significant proportion of people that work part-time on these platforms. In some senses, this is to do with the relationship to regulation and how the platform operates. In London, for example, you need a private hire driver's license to drive for Uber. You need a specific kind of car to drive for Uber. So the kinds of cars you can use are quite limited. So 9 times out of 10, if you get an Uber here, it's a Toyota Prius, because Uber likes to have this image in London of being more environmentally friendly and so on. So it's a white Toyota Prius. It's unusual if something else picks you up. And if it's something else, it's usually a more expensive vehicle from somebody who also does the higher end. I can never remember, they keep renaming the service, but like Uber Limo or Uber Exec or whatever. Whereas in the US, the first time I got an Uber in the US, I was really surprised to see that it was a very old car, that somebody was working part-time. Similarly, in South Africa, people are working full-time on these platforms. And I think in part, this is related to regulation and so on, but also related to what happens when people start driving. Is we always make a joke in London about the flexibility of Uber driving, which the drivers make often, which is you can work whenever you want, but you always work Friday night and Saturday night because you can't make enough money otherwise to do it. So work whenever you want, start at a different time on a Tuesday if you want to, but if you're not working the weekend and the rest of the week, you're not going to make enough money to cover the lease on the vehicle, the license cost, the insurance, and so on. And so I think in part, you can see why Uber encourages this elsewhere, because it gives it more of an image of self-employed people dipping in and out of the work and so on. The reality is that most drivers who make up the bulk of the transportation in many countries are full-time drivers. And in the UK in particular, these are people that used to work for minicab firms, which are a kind of, you couldn't pick them up off the street. You had to call them in advance, and Uber has essentially replaced that form of taxi entirely. You couldn't get a minicab in my neighborhood now. Whereas they compete with the black cabs in London, which are a kind of different offering that you can pick up off the street. But I do think, there are a couple of other things in Mike's comments that I think are quite useful. Is one of the things that I do think is important to remember about this is that Uber did offer something. It offered something to a section of workers who weren't able to get that work. Opened up the market to people that weren't able to enter in that way, with a promise of flexibility. And as a service, it also offers something to customers. I never got taxis or cabs in London, as most young people in London never used these services before Uber, because they were unreliable. They were very difficult to access. They didn't serve lots of neighborhoods. They have very successfully marketed themselves through this huge investment of money. It's not just gone on lobbying, they've also built a market. So there are 4 million regular users of Uber in London. This is a huge number of people, which makes it even more surprising for Tommaso's points of, how can you create a market of 4 million people and not be profitable? What on earth are they kind of doing with these dynamics? Then just very quickly to answer the second question, I think the dynamics of the strikes differ, and I'm just going to put a link in the chat from something that Callum Kant wrote about strike waves. I think some of these strikes, they often begin as local strikes and often hyper-local, so a particular neighborhood, but then they spread through these communication channels. So through WhatsApp particularly, and then also through Twitter and through Facebook. And Callum mapped out how the strikes in London were picked up by delivery riders in other countries. They sent solidarity messages and so on to each other. And you can actually see how they then go on to take strikes and a kind of wave of strikes that move outward. I still think the problem with this in a way is these are not majority strikes, right? These are not every single worker taking strike action. And they're often much more organic. So a chunk of people go on strike. They then begin pressuring other people to go on strike. It spreads out through the networks. But the risk is always that a section of people remain working because the platform offer a huge bonus to people that choose to break the strike. But one very small thing before I finish. The first time Uber Eats had a strike in London, we went to the strike. And Uber were offering a special offer where you could get a burger and drink and fries for £5. So the strikers ordered the cheap lunch, brought another driver to the picket line, shared the food out, recruited them to the strike. The next person ordered lunch, shared it out with people. And so they built the strike with the platform. And then eventually, as presumably somebody in Uber Eats head office saw these dots appearing and disappearing, cancelled the service in the zone for that day. But the level of enjoyment that people got out of this, not only were they costing the platform by using this special offer, but using some of the technology to build the strike, was a kind of really nice moment of the creativity of workers in struggle, right? And finding ways to overcome these things. So yeah, hopefully that's helpful.
Yeah, I would suggest that this, full-time, part-time is one way to sort of think about different kind of types of drivers or motivations for drivers. But I think it's much more important that we think about those who are economically dependent on the platform, irrespective of how many hours they actually work, particularly given that so many people who work on these types of platforms find themselves compiling a livelihood made up of other types of precarious work as well, whether it's all platforms or not. If the work that they're making as an Uber driver or as a food delivery person is what is helping them to pay their bills, that's why we need regulation for all of those people. We need to ensure that work is decent for all of those folks. Yes, there are handfuls of people, you know, who are on there for reasons that are not financial at all, for social reasons, because they're bored, for whatever. But I think that, you know, to Jamie's point, that like this is still work, and there are reasons that we regulate work, right? That's just important to come back to that. And New York City, so Uber's willingness to abide by these sort of rules and regulations in New York City kind of speaks to the ways in which New York City is not your typical city. As I mentioned, car ownership is expensive. More people in New York City work in a full-time basis than they do in other places. And also because New York City is one of the few cities where this corporation has been profitable. So if you compare this to, say, Austin, Texas, where there was a big debate around background checks, the city insisted that Uber complete background checks on those who were driving, and Uber's response was to pull out of the city altogether. It's an easy decision to make when you're losing money in a city, right? To try to sort of strong arm regulation in that kind of way. Whereas in New York City, as sort of one of these 5 profitable locations where they operate, they've shown that they're much more willing to not only to abide by certain regulations, but even to do things like hand over trip data to the city, which is then sort of available through freedom of information requests and the city's open data initiatives. I guess with this point on sort of pre-Uber, post-Uber shortages in sort of transportation infrastructure, medallion prices, the notion that it was sort of scarcity that led to these hyperinflated prices. There are lots of ways to regulate medallions. New York City that model is not the only way. There are cities where people hold medallions, you know, even sort of just over the bridge in New Jersey, cities where people hold medallions, they are owner operators, they drive, when they retire, the medallion goes back to the city and then goes to the next driver. That is a great way to ensure that there is not hyperinflation and that people do not end up saddled with toxic assets if the industry should change. So I'm really resistant to sort of these, what I feel like are false sort of dichotomies, that you either have to be like totally unregulated or you're going to end up with this really antiquated taxi system. There's a lot of space in between. And I think we are creative enough to think about ways that we can achieve both decent work for drivers who are working in the system and you know, a market that's capable of meeting consumer needs. And certainly, as the New York Taxi Workers Alliance would also say, and I've heard say that like a criticism of Uber is not an endorsement of what came before. That's like the whole point of my presentation, right? Is like there were problems before. But again, you know, I think we need to think creatively about like a different future, about something that we could create that would be more positive. And I guess to that point too, that, you know, the city had introduced green cabs, which I didn't discuss at all, to service, you know, outer borough areas. And arguably those are the folks that got thrown under the bus more than anybody else. It was a new project. It was terribly timed given the subsequent, you know, arrival of Uber. But those folks really have really suffered. It was never going to be as lucrative to drive in the outer boroughs. And the city just really folded on that program in a pretty serious way. So I guess in terms of this second question around Uber changing rules of the game in the car industry more broadly, you know, they have huge, there's a really great report that was put out by the National Employment Law Project in the States, looking at sort of Uber's lobbying effort to preempt legislation in a lot of cities. And I think this goes back to sort of the very first question around like, is this changing the way that we work? You know, is this always going to be sort of marginal work? And the US specifically has rampant issues with misclassification, almost irrespective of what industry you're working in. You know, there was an entire Obama initiative to try to address this, which unsurprisingly disappeared for the last 4 years. But this is the kind of legislation that they were proposing sort of preempted any effort to extend rights to people before those initiatives were even passed. And these companies were successful in sort of getting these carve-outs in states before really Uber was even super active, you know, in places that don't have huge taxi markets. And so I think that those types of initiatives, when they're introduced in places like, you know, the Dakotas, or, you know, these places that are sort of off the map when we think about technology and changing work, are maybe where we sort of need to look a little bit more deeply to see just how extensively the world of work more generally is being sort of penetrated by just like the continual shifting of risk from employers onto the shoulders of workers. So I'll just end there.
Thank you very much. I don't know if anyone has any more questions.
I would like just to ask the two speakers really very briefly, how do you see Uber and the situation of Uber workers, let's say 10 years from now? I know that this is a question that as a social scientist, I never would like to ask, where somebody ask me, what is going to be in 10 years? But I mean, how do you see the dynamics? Do you see that, I don't know, but the business model will fall apart? Uber will finally get the monopoly and it will be even much bigger than it is right now. Workers will get organized and the Uber will be regulated mostly everywhere in a way or another, or the contrary, Uber will deregulate. How do you see the dynamic? I know that parts of our work is to say that the dynamic are politically made. So that's why we do this work, is to provide a material for people that are organizing, for trade unions, for regulators to think things differently. So this is part of a changing world. But how do you see the future? How do you see things in terms of in 10 years from now, just as a science fiction exercise? If you like to play, otherwise you can say, no, I don't want, I prefer to understand.
I mean, I think this is a really important exercise to think through these things, right? Because I think much of the debate at the moment is about this kind of nebulous idea of the future of work, that there's some like imagined horizon out there that is going to be good or bad, but you know, how do we shape it in the here and now? And I think to play the exercise, I think I'm going to give two examples of what could happen, because I think these things are useful to think through. I think the first example is, what if these struggles were successful, right? What if these drivers get organized? What could an alternative look like? And I think, you know, Callum Can, who I've mentioned a couple of times, makes a really good argument about what Deliveroo could look like. Is imagine if workers had power on these platforms. Like, how would we reshape the platform into something that not only provided for those workers, but had a social benefit? So if these worker struggles were successful, imagine what seizing parts of Uber might look like, or seizing parts of Deliveroo or Uber Eats. Is the platform could provide connection to people that don't have connection, you know, to bring other people into the city, to deliver food to people that are hungry, to, you know, to build those kinds of social connections that many people have suffered from not having during COVID. So you could imagine that we could say that Uber is a utility, you know, much like broadband or electricity or water is, and that it should be run under workers' control. And that if you need to get somewhere, you get the workers' taxi and it comes and picks you up, right? On the flip side, I think we can imagine a much, much more dystopian vision where not only does Uber succeed in becoming a monopoly and testing these things out, but other parts of capital say, we would like to Uberize using this model. And I think his name is now escaping me, but the founder already runs a temporary staffing agency using the technology developed to Uber, and is trying to apply it to bar staff, to security staff, and so on. Is that we could see the dynamics of Uber being pushed into the much older dynamic of outsourcing, of cleaning, security, teaching assistants, healthcare assistants, nurses, parts of the university, where more and more of us only access our work on a temporary basis in that way, which is already the experience for many workers in lots of examples. But I think whether we go for that dystopia or that more utopian vision is determined about how these particular struggles that emerge right now, whether they're successful or not. So every time there's a strike, we get closer to the utopian version. Every time Uber wins a dodgy, paid for campaign around legislation or lobbies a parliament minister or expels workers from the platform, we get closer to the dystopian angle. And that's why this stuff matters, because there are many options unfolding at the moment.
Yeah, I like to imagine a more utopian future, in large part because it's just feels more motivating to me. Yeah, I'm always like worried that sort of if we think, oh, you know, this sort of techno-determinism, like this is where we're headed, there's nothing we can do. It's like you're on a bicycle, but really all you have to do is put a foot down, right? And then you can sort of change the direction that you're headed. And so to that, you know, I really believe in the power of workers and sort of collective action. And so one of the things that I like to think about is how we might build sort of broader solidarity, just generally. And so when I start to read about things like Uber trying to integrate itself into the last mile services, right? Or Uber trying to position itself to provide, you know, subsidized rides to public healthcare recipients, right? That when we, is particularly in cases like that, where we have public dollars flowing into those systems, where we have often unionized public service workers who work in those systems, that those to me seem like great opportunities for, you know, solidarity, to build solidarity across things, and also points of leverage. You know, one of the things that we often talk about is we don't know how many workers, we don't know this, we don't know that. These companies, they know all of this. And so all we need to do, sort of as those who are interested in public interest really, is to demand that they hand it over. And I think that's, you know, while New York is sort of an unusual case in some ways, it's also proof that that's possible. And so that's part of like the message that I hope to share in sharing that story.
Okay. I would say thank you very much, Tommaso, for providing for like the opportunity to close so nicely. Thanks, Jamie and Hannah, not only for your inspiring presentations, but for staying with us for this long session, for carefully answering all the questions you received. To those that, for example, missed the first part, we will also share this video on our website. So have a look if you want. We told you that we are on social media. If you want to have a look at the next appointment, Sebastian just shared the details with you in the chat. We have another appointment on the 5th of March. We will also have an international colloquium in June, our annual conference. If anybody is interested, the call is online. I know you guys have other commitments now. Sorry for keeping you until the very last minute. It's 4:59. Enjoy your evening, your weekend, and thank you very much again, everyone, for being with us. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Have a good
everyone.
Goodbye.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye.